everyone to our final session of our Cup of Cheer Embroider Along with Material Girls. I'm so excited. We finally reached the point of putting the finishing touches on our quilt, and we just may be ready by December 1st to start adding our first Advent piece. This week, we're going to talk about the final embellishments that need to be attached to the quilt, the quilting of the quilt, and yes, the quilt still needs some quilting, and then binding of our quilt. We're going to start with the final embellishments. If you are planning to send this quilt out to a long armor to quilt, you did not quilt your blocks in the hoop, you just have a plain quilt top, and you're going to send the long armor the quilt, you do not want to attach these embellishments until your long armor is finished. These can get in the long armor's way and cause problems, so we want to leave them off. If you are going to quilt the quilt, then you can attach them because it's easier for you to avoid them, but you may find it easier to leave them off until after all your quilting is complete. We're going to start with our dimensional wreath leaves, which is, there's a picture on page 31, I believe was the page number. So we're going to attach the dimensional leaves. There's, like I said, there's a picture on page 31. They are, zoom in here so that you can see, they are just attached randomly around the pieced wreath block that you have in your quilt. So we stitched them out back a few weeks ago. We've washed the stabilizer away and we've trimmed them up so that they are about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. We're going to put them together. It looks like we have 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 sets of 2. There's a set of 1, or there's 1 right there. Looks like there may be 3 sets of 3, but ultimately this is your quilt. You can put these leaves anywhere you want to put these leaves. If you turn to page 67, this is where we made the leaves, and they tell you to hand tack the leaves to the wreath. Now, I'm not going to hand tack, okay? I'm just not going to do it. We're going to do this by sewing machine because we can. So I have my machine set up, and I'm actually going to use the button sew-on stitch so that I can sew on the Bernina. It's probably around stitch 60 or 61. It's going to jump back and forth, and it's going to do that hand tack for me. Okay, doesn't need to be anything fancy. I am using a thread color on top of my machine that matches the color of the wreath. Also on this wreath, we're going to talk about it later, but you have a 3/4 inch smooth side piece of Velcro that is still not attached to anywhere, that you can go ahead and attach to the center top. I just did a straight line, an X. I made it look like a snowflake. So if you look back where it is stitched on here for the snowman, they're kind of made like a snowflake. I just basically stitched an X and came through the middle so that it held it in place for me. Okay, nothing fancy. We just need that Velcro to stay there so that we can get that bow in place. I am going to go ahead and grab my bow I want to stick that bow on. Isn't he just so cute? So that I can see what the overall wreath looks like, and I can make it look better. I'm going to use these little leaves to cover up my connectors, okay, that were there. So I'm going to just kind of play with, we have different shapes and different sizes that you have embroidered. Once I get them in place, I'm just going to kind of put a piece of tape over them to hold them in place. Now, once you have your leaves all in place, it's going to take a little bit of fiddling, and I'm going to try my best to do this with the camera here. I'm going to, I have my button sew on foot. If you don't have a button sew on foot, that's fine. You can use a clear foot will work. I'm going to come in, I'm going to put my foot down. I'm going to run the default settings for this particular stitch, and we're going to see we can jump, we can we can widen up the stitch if we need, but we may run this a few times to make sure that we get everything covered. Once the button sew on stitch is done, just keep your foot on the gas on a Bernina and it will stop when it's done what it needs to do. You're going to pull it towards you, and that's going to pull the stitch off of the little toe in the middle. And I'm going to come over and I'm going to come and do this again just to make sure that I've grabbed all of the leaves. Here are my tacked on leaves. Now, if you do it by hand, it's going to be a little more invisible. I think this, I'm fine with this. From a distance, I actually think I can kind of pull those up, and these can be a little bent and curled while hanging to give it a little bit of dimension. But I'm going to repeat this process with each set of leaves all the way around. All our leaves are attached. I've given them all just a little pull to make sure that they're all caught and attached. Nothing's gonna come off on me. And I'm gonna call those hand tacked on and ready to go. Our next step in attaching embellishment is to attach the dimensional holly leaves that we made, just like we made those wreath leaves. Grab a hold of them here. These are going to get attached to the Deck the Halls block. So if you look at page 67, the bottom of 67, you will see that the 2 leaves and a button, okay, and then 2 leaves and a button in the corners. So we have 4 leaves, 2 leaves and a button, and then 2 leaves and a button. Leave that 3rd button off to the side. We'll use it later. Okay, So I'm going to take and attach these leaves just like I attached the last leaves. So I'm going to pick the location that I want these particular leaves to be in. Okay. And I'm going to pick the combination of leaves that I want. I'm going to make sure that I have both of them. I'm going to leave them. I'm going to be quilting this. Oh. So I'm going to leave them a little bit out of the way of quilting. So I'm eventually going to be probably stitching in the ditch here. So I'm going to make sure that I'm going to stitch them someplace that I can fold this back out of the way and get to this ditch. Okay, because I've not quilted this yet. I'm doing this attachment, and then I will go through and attach those later. So I think I'm going to, this block stays empty, so maybe I'll bring those a little more up here. It's eventually also going to get a button. Kind of hangs out right there. And the same with this block here. I'm probably going to go I don't think I want to be right above the move this up a little. The wreath bow is right underneath of this. So I think I'd rather it be kind of off-centered from that. So I'm going to move it over here. Those leaves go up. That button is going to stitch right there. Set of leaves that are up there in that corner. I'm actually get some jingle bells attached to them. So there'll be something that hangs off of those that button. Okay. I'm going to attach that. I'm not going to worry about the button right this second. We're going to set that to the side. I'm going to go and repeat the same steps that I just did with the previous leaves, and then we will attach the buttons. The next step is the tree block, and so the tree top. And so here is our tree top. We have 7 very small little buttons here that are going to get attached to this tree block. These are 3 of them will be used to attach the 3 lace ornaments that will live in 7, 8, and 9's pocket. 1 second. So if you look at page 69 in your book, you will see the layout. Feel free to put them anywhere you would like. One exception will be the button that is on this bottom right hand branch. You want to make sure you do have one there, because that is going to be the attachment point for the twine that will hold our stockings. So just make sure that you've got at least one button there, but the rest of them can be attached anywhere you like. And I'm going to use the same technique that I have been using. Once your buttons are all attached, the remaining steps that we have to do are going to be require some hand sewing. First, we're going to deal with all of the baker's twine that we have in our kit. So you have some baker's twine that was wrapped around this card. We're going to cut it into a couple of different pieces. First, we're going to cut 3 pieces that are 12-inch in length. We're going to tie 1 to each of the jingle bells. So I've tied, basically took it through the loop at the top of the bell, tied it in a good double knot, and then had a strand. I did that 3 times. I put all 3 together and kind of pulled and changed the lengths of them so that they all hung at a different length, and then I tied them into a knot. Okay, these are going to wrap over this button and hang. And so you may want to wrap them and test your length to see if they hit in a location that you are okay with. Once you've got them tied, you can take them off and put them in your Advent bag, because they are one of the Advent steps. Our next step is to take a 12-inch piece of twine. We're going to come down here to that tree. So I have a piece of twine. I'm going to tie a knot. I'm going to do this with needle and thread. She tells you in the book that you can hand tack the twine to the berry on the branch. He is then going to extend over to the snowman's hand and be tacked in place there. So have it back up to the top, looking like it's coming from behind this little guy, and I'm going to get my stockings out and clothespins, just so that I can kind of get a feel for how low I want this to hang. And he's gonna go to the snowman's hand. So I'm gonna do the same thing that I just did, tying at, or basically stitching down in an area here. She tells you to trim this because you're going to take another 12-inch piece and you're going to tie it in a bow. And then you're going to tack that to his hand, kind of covering up that look that you've got going on right there. There's my bow wrapped around my snowman's hand, ultimately just looking like it's strung from the tree, and he's holding on to the extra. And then that is where our stockings will get clipped to. So I'm going to pull those off. We're done with those. You have a tree that you embroidered, and if you've not already done so, we talked about it when we embroidered it, but you want to have your twine wrapped around the tree for attaching to the top of our car. And then our final step is going to be up here with the 2 mittens. Okay, so she tells you to have a 12-inch piece of twine. This is my last one, so I'm just using what's left. It's more than 12 inches. She says, arrange a 12-inch piece of twine between the mitten blocks, forming a heart in the twine. So we're going to start here, and the piece of twine is going to end on this side of the mitten, and the excess, she has you form a heart right up here. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take my twine, I'm going to take that same stitch right here in the corner of this mitten. And I'm actually going to go up and down and then back up again, just so that I can make sure that I am very knotted in this corner. Okay. I'm going to take my twine and then I'm just going to bring it over to the far corner of this mitten, and we're going to tack it in place. And I'm not going to unthread the needle. I'm not going to tie anything off yet because I want to make my heart, okay, that we have. So she kind of shows you that you're going to bring your thread up and we're going to make a loop. And then you're going to kind of form a heart. We're going to tack it down, so don't overly stress over it. I just want to make sure that we leave enough thread or enough twine here to make the heart that you want. Oh, there it is. Don't touch it, Amy. Don't touch it. I'm going to tape it in place for the moment. I'm going to pull back some of this string just so that it's a little bit loose that we've got going on there. Let me put a piece of tape across that one, so everything doesn't move on me. Now I'm going to tack off or tie off this section of the mitten. So I'm going to get some red embroidery thread. I swear my sewing table eats scissors. I started out with 3 pairs of scissors here, and now I can't find any of them. Probably all under the quilt. I'm going to double strand this, so I'm going to pull it through, pull my two ends together, and tie them in a knot. Okay. And I'm going to carefully remove one of these pieces of tape. Hold on to that, and I'm just basically going to tack this in place. When I come up though, I'm going to come up and make sure that I stitch through the twine just so that it can't slide back and forth. And then once I get the twine, kind of split the twine and stitch through it, and then I'm just going to stitch a couple of loops, and we're going to repeat. So in the instructions, she kind of shows you that you're going to tack down at the tops of each heart, and then you're going to tack down at the center. I'm pretty happy with that heart. Now, when our heart is finished, we now have used all our twine. We've got our mitten block is done, the stocking block is finished, and our deck the halls jingle bells are done, and the tree that goes on top our car. So we've done all of those. We have completed the bells. The last step for attaching embellishments is going to be the hook and loop that we need to attach to the top of the wreath block and on top of our car. So you can see we need that one at the top of our wreath block for our bow, and then there is one that goes at the top of our car. That car block, there's not really, it's going to depend upon your car. If you did the little bug car or the station wagon, I would take your tree, kind of position your tree where you want it to be on your car, and then just kind of lift up and mark on your fabric where you want that piece of Velcro. And then, like I said, just stitch a little star to hold it in place. And then you'll have your tree attachment will be there for your car. And then we're finished embellishing this quilt, getting everything ready, because now it's time to start actually quilting the quilt. One moment here. Let me grab the two things that I forgot to talk about, because they're important. We have the one embellishment piece that is the holly. If you've not already done so, you will attach the button, in the same manner that we attach the button to the quilt. Just layer that on top and tack that in place. And then our heart, okay? The heart block goes down here. It's the very last one. We sewed originally those metal clips to the back. Now we need to attach the hangers for those clips. So I figured out where I wanted my heart again. Then I just kind of held it in place, lifted it up, and marked where these brackets lined up at. And then I stitched on the little pieces by hand. I just did, I used thicker thread. I did not use my 50 weight cotton thread. I used a 30 weight thread, I believe it was, just to give it a little bit, because again, over the years it's going to be on and off, on and off. And then tack those in place, and then you will be ready to hang your heart on that after you put the music box in it. So we have our music box piece. Make sure you pull the little tab, plastic tab, out of the music box. He goes in that back little pocket, and then he slides in place, just like that. Now we're done with the embellishments on the quilt. With all our embellishing complete, it's now time to put the backing and the binding on to our quilt. Now, even if you have quilted your quilt in the hoop, we still need to do some sort of quilting to hold the backing to the quilt, because otherwise it's gonna be really loose and kind of like a balloon. They'll separate. It really won't look the best. Doesn't need anything fancy. I just stitched in the ditch. That's it. And you don't even have to stitch in every ditch. The other optional piece for this is to add an additional layer of batting. So once you have laid your quilt out, you may want it to have a little bit more body to it than what you have in it with just the embroidery batting. So I did add another layer of a polyester thin poly batting to my quilt. I layered it just like I was going to quilt a regular quilt, making sure that you have a little bit of extra backing and batting on all 4 sides of the project. In the book, she tells you, or in the pattern, she tells you the yardage for the backing is like 2 2/3. That is just enough for you to have extra on both sides. It's, I think, a little close to being fiddly for it, but it will work just fine without any piecing needed. I did go with like 3.5 yards, and I did put a seam in my batting just to give me a little bit more, because my quilt was pushing 43 across, and the width of fabric is only like 44, 45, and it was just a little too close to comfort, and it required a little too much fiddling for making sure that I had backing at that end and at this end. If my quilt was laying straight, it just was too much for me. So I laid my backing right side down. I put a layer of batting on top of that, and then I laid my quilt on top. For stitching in the ditch for this project, I opted to stitch in some of the ditches, not all of them. I did stitch in the ditch here between the inner and outer border. You don't have to do both. You could choose just to do just the inner border, or you could do just the outer border. You do not have to do both of them, but I opted to do both, and I just found a thread. And then I kind of looked at the sections that we had pieced together, trying to find rectangles and squares that would keep my backing and batting attached to my quilt top in the recommended distance that batting will tell you. So with most battings, you're looking at like 6 to 8 inches apart. All the labeling will tell you for that, which just means that you need a line of stitching every so many inches. So I don't necessarily need to do every single line that's in here, but I could do rectangles, I could do squares, and things along that lines for this project. So maybe you can kind of see that I have some larger rectangles, some smaller ones. The only thing that I made sure of is that when I had finished stitching in the ditch, I made sure that I had every unit was a full unit, and that I didn't have like a rectangle with one side not sewn. I wanted to make sure that these were all full shapes that I had, and then I also made sure that I had stitched all of the borders that were there. I'm also going to be putting a sleeve on this quilt, and so I've made a sleeve. I will put in the video comments as well as the instructions, the chat here during the live for the tutorial that I like to follow from Krista Watson for making her sleeve. I'm going to add my sleeve before or while I put my binding on, and then I only need to hand sew one side of the sleeve. But if you're not sure how you are going to hang it or who you are going to give this is going to hang it, you can always add a sleeve later. It does need to be a full sleeve, the full length of the quilt. The little corner triangle hangers aren't going to hold up the middle of our quilt. So it does need to be a full sleeve. It could be tabs. You could have hanging tabs if you wanted. I want it to kind of to be more invisible so that it kind of looks like it's floating on the wall. So I did take a 8.5-inch wide piece of fabric, the length of my quilt. Okay, so my quilt was 42, an 8.5 by 42-inch piece. This is extra backing, okay, that I'm using. I have hemmed both edges, and then I've done the steps for ironing and creasing so that I have extra to accommodate the diameter of a dowel rod or anything in there. If you just do this flat and then go to put in something that has a diameter, it's a tight fit and it kind of pulls on the quilt from the front. So you do want to give it a little bit of extra fabric to accommodate for that. Okay. Now, once my backing is on, I'm stitched in the ditch. I did do green thread to match my backing. In my top of my quilt, I actually did invisible thread, okay, or clear. I didn't want to have to change colors, and you're not going to say that I'm always the best straight driver. And so by using the clear thread, if I did kind of go off the ditch or a little bit, it's not super noticeable, especially if like here against this red. If I went into the red with white thread, you could see it. If I had gone into these prints with the red thread, you'd see it. So I opted to do invisible thread. My tips for you with invisible thread. I prefer a polyester invisible. So monopoly from Superior is by far my preferred. I used the clear and not the smoke. I do drop my upper tension on the machine down to between 2.5 and 3.5. You may want to test it. I don't want a lot of pressure or stretching or tension put onto that polyester because that sometimes is what causes polyester to break. In stitching in the ditch for this entire quilt, doing that setting of lowering my upper tension, using a walking foot and things, I only had the thread break once on this entire quilt. I did not need to use any sort of sewer's aid or silicone. I threaded my machine like I normally do, with the exception I did use a Wonder Guard or a thread net on that particular spool of thread because invisible thread is known as a thread with memory. So if you've ever noticed when it comes off the spool, it's still curly. So by using a thread net or a guard, it puts a little bit of tension at the spool to keep it from wanting to spiral as it feeds into your machine. Okay. Once you have that completed, it is time to make the binding. If you've not already done so, the binding on the quilt is cut at 2 1/4 inches, 6 strips, the width of fabric by 2 1/4. If you prefer 2.5-inch binding, you do have enough fabric to do 2.5. You're going to assemble and make binding just like you would for any other quilt. And then we're going to head over to the machine and we are going to attach this binding to the quilt. I'm going to use my 1/4 inch foot with my dual feed attached. If you do not have a dual feed, you want to use a walking foot still with all of this. I'm going to pull off some binding. Never start your binding in a corner. And since I'm using 2 1/4 inch binding, I'm going to be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay. I have to find my glasses because I can't see anything. I'm going to start with about 6 to 8 inches of binding tail. And then I'm going to start sewing down from that. So I have 6 to 8 inches of loose binding, and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch seam, matching up my edges. Now I'm going to hand sew my binding to my quilt, so therefore I'm sewing my binding to the front of my quilt. If you would like to machine sew your binding down, I prefer to sew binding to the back of my quilt, fold it to the front, and top stitch it from here. I just prefer to see the edge that I'm top stitching. Of an inch away from this edge. I don't want to do that marking until I get close to it because things move. I'm going to be sewing to that pin or that mark that I've made, and I'm going to stop with my needle in the down position. I'm going to raise my foot and I'm going to rotate my quilt 45 degrees so that now I'm going to stitch diagonally into the corner of my quilt. So the corner of my quilt is right there, and I'm going to sew directly off the edge of my quilt. I'm going to do a little back stitch. That diagonal sewing is going to help us fold our miter. So with my quilt sitting just like it came out of the machine, I'm going to take my binding, I'm going to fold it back diagonally across that seam that I just sewed. Okay, so you can kind of see that it folds right into the corner. I'm going to hold on to that fold right there, and then I'm going to fold my binding back over top of it. So I've got a fold at this edge, a fold at the top, and my raw edge at the bottom. The key to a good miter, a good folded miter, is your fold needs to be at the edge, and all layers of your binding need to be stacked on top of each other at the top. So you can see that I can't see any of my binding fold at the top here. Once that is done, we can rotate the quilt here. And I'm going to start sewing again the 1/4 inch from the edge of here, but I'm going to start at the edge of the quilt. Another corner is on. Fold it back. Diagonal comes into the corner of the quilt. Fold it back over the top. Line everything up. I just like to put a pin in it to hold everything for me. Now, at the top of my quilt, on the wrong side, I have aligned that quilt sleeve so that the edge of the quilt sleeve is at the edge of the quilt, and I'll catch the top of it in the 1/4 of an inch. So I'm gonna take and first few wonder clips and go ahead and clip my binding in. Rotate and repeat again to the next corner. I've just folded my final corner. This is the start binding and this is my end binding. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold each of the bindings back over themselves. So I'm just going to take this and fold it over themselves, at least 1.5 inches or more fold that you have there. And then, so my start binding, I'm going to fold over about 1.5 inches, 2 inches. My my end binding, I'm going to carefully bring down. I'm going to fold it back on top of itself, and I'm going to butt them right next to the start binding. Okay, so it's folded on itself. I've got it nice and flat. It's not twisted. It fits right here for that. Once I folded it back on itself, I'm actually going to fold back a little bit more so that I have about 1/8 of an inch gap between the start binding and the end binding. So it's hard to see, but there is a space between these two. Okay, I'm going to take my iron. I'm going to give it a good press so that I have a nice crease, because now I need to trim this, and I need to trim this tail so that I can put these together and join them into one strip. So here comes a little bit of math, but don't get scared because I'm going to teach you how to do it without even needing to do math. The distance that we trim from this point out is what we call half the width of the binding. Well, you know, I don't need to know really what that is, because that number is, because this here is the full width of our binding, and this is half the width of our binding, right? So I'm going to take my binding fabric, I'm going to lay it down on top of the start binding, lining up the fold of that binding with the fold of my start binding. And the distance from here to the raw edge is half the width of the binding. I'm going to take a pair of scissors. You can also mark it with a marker if you wanted. And I'm going to trim the excess off. I'm not trimming the bottom layer of binding. I'm only trimming that tail portion that I folded back. I'm going to trim it even with my ruler. Okay, so you can see I still have my binding is still there, and I just cut off that little piece. Okay. I'm going to repeat this now with the top piece. I'm going to take my ruler, and then I'm just going to cut the top layer even with that, so I can cut that off, and now I have these nice 2 little tabs. All right. Next, we're going to take our ending binding strip. We're going to unfold it so that it's right side down, and then we're going to flip it so that it's right side up on the ironing board. Okay. And you'll see there's some creases in it. My beginning binding, I'm going to open up. I'm going to leave it right side down, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees and lay it right sides together with my ending strip that's laying on the ironing board. We have this crease and this crease we are going to align. Okay. So when you align them, it's okay if the bindings stick out. That's not a problem. We want to match that mark. That's the most important. Once I have them matched, I'm going to put some pins here. If you need, you can draw a line, and we are going to sew from the upper left corner straight down to the lower right-hand corner. Okay. I'm not going to draw anything because I think if I sew right inside that white line right there, it's exactly where I need to be. So we're going to go back over to the machine and we're going to sew that line. Now, before you get too excited, don't do any cutting until we make sure that this binding fits and that it's not twisted. Okay, here's our binding. Just kind of fold it back up. Everything fits along this line. I don't have any gaps. It's not too tight. It's not too loose. It's not twisted. It's all is good. Then I'm going to take and trim the dog ear. I'm going to press this seam open. You can go back to the ironing board if you like. I usually just finger press it. I'm going to refold my binding. Then we're going to go back to the machine. We're going to back stitch at the beginning, sew all the way down, a little past where we started, back stitch at the end, and our binding will be attached. And just like that, you're not going to be able to tell where your binding started and stopped for this particular project. And your binding is on. Now, if you're going to hand sew your binding, you are ready to do so. So we can fold that to the back and do our traditional hand stitching. If you are machine sewing your binding on, at this point I usually go to the iron and I iron the binding out away from the back of the quilt so that it sticks out like this, and then you would fold it over, position it to the top, and then stitch close to this edge. If you sewed your binding to the front and you want to machine sew it down, it's a little more fiddly, but the key is that your binding or your ditch is designated by this seam that you use to sew the binding that's attached the binding to the quilt. So your fold of your binding needs to come about 1/16 of an inch past that, so that when you go to stitch in the ditch, that when you go to stitch in the ditch between the binding and the border, it's going to come out very close to the edge. I call this blind machine binding because you're going at the trying to catch the raw edge consistently all the way around. So there's, you know, a lot of prep work that has to be done in order to make sure that you don't miss it or you don't end up with, you know, some that are really close to the edge and some that are really far apart, which is why if I'm going to machine sew binding, it's sewn to the back, flip to the front, and then I'm top stitching right where I can see it. Nobody needs to know if the seam goes in the ditch on the back or not, because this is going to be hanging on the wall. Okay? Nobody's going to look at it. Then it will be all finished once our binding is complete. As with any quilt, you should always label them so that you have record of your quilt for the individual. So Kimberbell does have available for download a quilt label, embroidery design that kind of coordinates with the Cup of Cheer quilt. So you can download this. You do not need to type in the information. I would think, depending on how much you wanted to put on the label, I would probably handwrite that information, unless you just wanted to put a single individual's name or that type of thing. So depending on what you wanted to put in the label, you could do so, because you could very easily edit this and not stitch the words made by. It could just be cheerfully, and you could, write in made for so and so, or something along that lines, but it would probably need to be handwritten due to the size that the lettering would have to be. It's way too small for most of the built-in embroidery lettering on your machines. Well, I have enjoyed hanging out with you guys for the last 3 months. Last 12 weeks, we have done it. The quilt is technically ready. I will hand sew the next couple of days, and on December 1st, it will be ready to put on that first project. I hope that you are making progress on your quilt. Remember, this holiday comes every year, so it doesn't have to be done this year. Just keep plugging away at it. We would love to see your finished quilts. Please, if you post on social media, post on our page, tag us in Instagram. We love to see the progress you've made and love to see your finished project. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you in 2024.